Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Farouk Sahabdin. I serve as the office coordinator for the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies at Emmanuel College, and I would like to welcome you to our second lecture in the summer 2020 Eastern Mediterranean Security Studies Conference. Emmanuel College and the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies since 2012 has been organizing a 4-week Eastern Mediterranean Security Studies program for students and young academics interested in the interaction of democracy, energy, geopolitics, and security in the region. This competitive program has allowed students and participants to study and experience firsthand the importance of the region that has been cultural, economic, and a geopolitical vortex since antiquity. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic is yet another conditionality that has altered the dimensions of security and complexity in the area. Since travel in the region is prohibited this summer, IEMS, in cooperation with the Constantine G. Karamanlis Chair in Hellenic and European Studies and the Institute of International Relations, will be hosting a 1-week program of focused lectures, presentations, and panel discussions. The 1-week program will bring experts from the region in 2 sets of lectures aimed at assessing democracy, energy, and geopolitics, and on the role of leadership, diplomacy, and statecraft in this ever-changing security environment of the Eastern Mediterranean. Our presenters come from different countries of the region, as well as backgrounds, and we have a mixture of policymakers, diplomats, and academics. The full program is available once you register for the conference. And today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Mr. Thanassis Cambanis. Briefly, Mr. Cambanis is an author, journalist, and senior fellow at the Century Foundation. He's a co-director of the Century Foundation's Foreign Policy Program. His work focuses on U.S. foreign policy, Arab politics, and social movements in the Middle East. He's currently writing a history of the Iraq War and its transformative impact on the international system. He has published books about Hezbollah and the Egyptian Revolution and has edited 4 collections of policy research about rights, politics, and security in the Middle East. He regularly contributes to the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Atlantic, the Nation, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and other publications. He teaches at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. And it's such a privilege to have him here today. Now, before I turn the mic over to our speaker, I wanted to let you know that I'll be acting as the host of this event. We'll guide the Q&A, which will follow a 25 to 30-minute presentation. The duration of the program will be about an hour and a half. I would like you to turn off your microphone if you haven't already, and to either use the chat or to raise your hand for a question. We will try to answer all the questions, but it's so great to have all of you here, and hope that we can have a very productive presentation and discussion. So without further ado, Mr. Cambanis.
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction. And I'd like to thank Petros and the organizers of this conference for inviting me to speak in this experimental online format. Today, my main challenge is to see if I can engage your interest and attention in this odd and attenuated format. So I'm gonna do my best to be engaging and interactive. And I do look forward to the extent that it's possible, having a conversation with you after what I hope are short remarks and framing thoughts by me, so that we can talk more about what you're interested in than what I'm interested in. And without further ado, I'll launch into the subject at hand. The invitation to speak here came at an opportune moment for me because I'm in the process of trying to think about how the popular uprisings that we've continued to see for a decade in the Arab world and in the Middle East more broadly connect to the uprisings and the social unrest and governance failures that we're seeing accelerate in the rest of the world, and especially in Europe and the United States. So these central questions of accountability, corruption, rights, governance, the gap between what's perceived as foreign policy and what's perceived as domestic policy has really been collapsing, I'd say, since September 11th at least, but absolutely in an accelerating fashion in the last couple of years, as pathologies that are often described as uniquely Middle Eastern or somehow other are manifesting in places like the United States and Europe that are considered mature democracies. And to me, that's a really interesting moment to study. It's also a very interesting policy conundrum. What is to be done? What is the right response to these problems? My work does straddle two spheres. A lot of the writing I do and commission and publish is essentially research, some of it purely academic, some of it policy research, trying to answer the question of what is, what some community or another supposed to do to better handle events. And some of it is descriptive, trying to understand dynamics and identify how much of what's happening is caused by who. And it's been a really rich and I'd say expectation redefining period since the uprisings that began in the fall or the summer of 2010. If I were to summarize in a minute what I'm about to say in half an hour, I'd say that that protests and popular uprisings are symptoms of system failures, and that as popular uprisings have adapted, so too have the autocrats that seek to crush them, and that finally the autocrats in the Middle East have really conveniently availed themselves of Western constructions of security and stability to justify their own authoritarian bargains and their own refusals to change their governing compacts with their subjects. So that's sort of my central framing concept. And what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what's happened with the uprisings in Iraq and Lebanon, and explain why I think those two uprisings are particularly important to think about, and what kind of role I think they play in shaping dynamics more widely in the region. And then I'm going to end with a sort of broader look at the other governments that have an impact in what happens in the region, from neighboring countries in the MENA region to Western governments and their foreign policy and how it impacts what happens in the region. So to begin with, I locate the beginning of this wave of revolts in a sort of epic failure of states to deliver on their end of the bargain with the governed. So in any context, whether it's a democracy or an authoritarian state, there's a certain amount of there is accountability and feedback, even in a dictatorship. Governments are expected to provide some level of welfare and well-being, and they're expected to have some kind of feedback loop that allows them to correct from the mishandling of governance crises. Now, these are, I think it's been well documented that in non-democracies, these feedback loops function more poorly. That's famously why famines are almost exclusively something that occurs in authoritarian states. And at the same time, we know from our own experiences with observing the European Union countries and the United States, the feedback loops in ostensibly democratic countries can be sluggish or equally broken, as we're seeing today in the United States. That said, in the Arab world, there have been some unique and I would argue catastrophic failures to fulfill the bare minimum of the promise of the state. So the state is supposed to keep people relatively safe from most threats. It's supposed to keep people relatively in health and in nutrition. And this kind of minimal promise began to really break down by the end of the Cold War, and when the superpowers stopped pouring as much money and aid into these moribund Arab economies, they found themselves dividing up less and less, and retooling the purposes of the state towards regime preservation rather than some combination of regime preservation and governance. By the time we get to 2010, what we had was, I would argue, a series of cascading systemic failures and a dramatic repositioning of the international context, which freed the hand of authoritarian regimes to focus even less than they were initially doing on matters of governance and rights. And there isn't a mathematical formula to this, but in a weak state or in a poorly functioning state, there's some minimum amount of either rights or governance that has to be in place for the polity to function or for the polity to win the consent of the governed. So this is, roughly, you could roughly think of this as bread and dignity, or services and ideology, but it's some amount of rights, some amount of stuff. And in the 2000s, the key states in the Arab world began to fail on all these scores, and their predatory regimes found themselves with a lot of wind in their sails as a result of America's illegal and destructive war in Iraq. So the United States, having toppled the government in Iraq and disbanded all its institutions, and then having, I would argue, incompetently and probably criminally mismanaged the occupation, had given the despots of the world the gift of the global war on terror. So the US government, which had, for much of modern history, put human rights on the table as one of the rhetorical talking points, and had made, at the very least, the appearance or lip service to certain norms of international behavior part of the language of international relations, essentially scrapped that wholesale and made counterterrorism the primary framing conceit of world affairs, and especially in the already unstable Middle East, which was labeled and perceived as the primary locus of this terrorism that was the subject of the global war. And the goals that the United States put forward were stability and security, as they defined it. And I want to be cautious to make clear that I don't believe this is the only engine of what has happened in the Arab world, and to make clear that the primary driver of what happens in the Arab world lies in the Arab world, with Arab states primarily, and to a lesser extent with citizens and subjects. Agency is in the region, not outside of it. But at this particular juncture, I think the international framing was pivotal because it simultaneously broke a lot of existing norms that had restrained some of the worst excesses of behavior. It destabilized huge swaths of the region, starting with Iraq, which became a vacuum of non-governance because of the actions of the United States. And finally, it set up a new reward structure in which authoritarians that were willing to position themselves as on the American side of this war on terror would be given a free pass from even those sins of omission or commission that previously would have cost them transactionally some amount of support or goods or political cover. The result has been very interesting in the last 10 years, because what happened in 2010 was not predicted by any regional expert, and people rose up en masse against these ideologically bankrupt and practically failed regimes across the region. In a few cases, they were successful. In Tunisia, they've been long-term, Tunisia is the only long-term success in this series of uprisings that's in its 10th year now. But in Egypt, there was a brief period of popular rule and at least electoral democracy before a new coup came in and reestablished authoritarianism to an even greater degree than before. But what's been really amazing to watch is that public sentiment and popular movements against predatory regimes have only grown despite the enormous cost of opposing violent dictatorships. So the signal authoritarian response has been Syria's, where the dictator of Syria responded to popular protests with a no quarters, completely nihilistic and violence maximalist response, and decided not to brook even the slightest discussion of reform or change in the governing compact, even to mildly adjust the elite bargain that dominated Syria, and instead to go for a complete smiting, violent smiting of any resistance to the authoritarian regime. And they have essentially, for now, won after destroying an enormous part of the country, displacing half the population at a minimum, killing 500,000 people, and probably for 3 or 4 generations, destroying the livelihood and well-being of any person who lives in Syria, including on the regime side. So this was an enormous sort of scorched earth response to a call for reform, and authoritarians around the region paid attention. So they saw that in Egypt, a dictatorship was able to reassert itself, that in the Gulf, authoritarian monarchs were able, through a combination of violence and inducements, to tighten their grip, and that in Syria, ultimately, this dictatorship was able to stay in power despite some international condemnation and a war that was funded, at least in part, by some of the richest countries in the world against the regime, and where, in my view, the claims of the popular movement were undeniably correct and just. The popular movement began as a nonviolent movement, and it could have quite easily been resolved short of regime change, if the regime had been willing to capitulate on any of the governance issues or rights issues. And what the government in Iraq proved is that in Syria proved is that it could, if it was willing to demand a maximalist, or rather to employ maximalist techniques and demand the ultimate price from those who resisted it, it could stay in power. So that is the calculus that other authoritarians in the region have been looking toward. Now, Lebanon and Iraq were late to rise up, and that's for very specific reasons to the context in those two countries. One, they saw what happened in other Arab countries that rose up. Two, both were countries that had suffered decades of war and violence, and were still living under the consequences of state collapse that was the result of long-term war. And so nobody in either Iraq or Lebanon would lightly take to the streets and call for the overthrow of the system, because they knew firsthand just how deadly the system could be to protect itself, and also just how deadly it could be to deal with the civil strife and the unintended consequences that come from challenging a rigid authoritarian state. Now, it's instructive that the regimes in these two countries were given every chance to peaceably and incrementally address even the most minimal concerns about rights and governance. So we're talking about two signally broken polities, right? Countries, I mean, in Iraq's case, a country with oil wealth, which until recently meant that they had quite a cash-rich budget, a great deal of human capital, a bureaucracy that, for all its flaws, is capable of governing a vast and wealthy country with a large population. In Lebanon's case, a much smaller and more easily, at least theoretically, governed state with between 3 and 4 million citizens, and again, a huge amount of money in its banking sector and in the economy from remittances. But in both cases, we had governments that had by design chosen to entirely orient themselves towards perpetuation of corrupt rents and not and not towards addressing any of the actual challenges of governance. So I'll talk a little bit about the trajectory of Iraq alone and then go to Lebanon. So in Iraq, the sectarian system that was put in place by the US occupying power proved to have a lot of enduring appeal for Iraq's new class of warlords and militia leaders and sectarian bosses. So by the time the Americans largely left in the second year of the Obama administration, the Iraqi governing class found that it could continue to take all the patronage that came through the government and share virtually none of it with the citizens, except in the form of payroll salaries to state employees, which have ended up being something like a third or a half of the national GDP. And they found through cycle of election after cycle of election, they could fail to deliver electricity, healthcare, due process, a judicial process, even the most basic security, as evinced by the successful rise of ISIS and its takeover of nearly half the territory of Iraq. They literally didn't function on any of the axes that a state is supposed to function, and they were able to continually keep a monopoly of all the sources of power and revenue in the state. And they did this by never having an opposition, a political opposition. So after every election, a national unity government was formed, usually after long and intense negotiations that were literally going down to the level of directors general and sometimes even lower of ministries, saying, you know, which political movement will get this job, which political movement gets to control this checkpoint, and so on. And it was all about patronage to parties, and every single vote getter got some slice of the pie, which meant that nobody who was a politician or a militia leader was actually opposed to the system. So what we've ended up with today is a country that is not only not governed, but not administrated, where drinking water is poisoned, where even the lucrative oil fields aren't managed with modern technology, where courts can't adjudicate crimes with anything resembling a fair due process. And the governing system is completely self-perpetuating. So no amount of public rejection has any impact over what the government does. So we have a complete divorce of the state from accountability. And you know, we often analyze this from in a deterministic way. We look at the state's failure to rein in militias and provide security, or we look at the state's failure to provide a unifying identity and narrative about itself, or the state's failure to provide services that are easily achievable, such as drinking water or a minimal amount of healthcare. But what this sort of approach overlooks is that none of those goals are the goals of the state in the first place. The goal of the state is to perpetuate the group of stakeholders that get the authority and the patronage, money and power that flows through state coffers and through the security apparatus, and then to use those primarily to remain in power. And that is unfortunately an eminently sustainable setup. So what we saw in Iraq was a unbelievably brave and creative protest movement that has been simmering for many years. It sort of broke into public consciousness in 2015 with a series of summertime protests that were originally spurred by the lack of electricity to give adequate air conditioning, and also the mistreatment of mostly Sunni areas by a largely Shia government, and also the failures of the state to prevent the rise of ISIS. But those protests have grown over several years. They're profound and interesting. They include representatives of all types of political ideology and of sectarian identity. They are, I would argue, not sectarian protests. They are Iraqi nationalist protests by mostly young people who want to see their state perform its basic functions. They're largely devoid of an ideological demand or a political agenda. They're most often framed about being about justice and anti-corruption, which allows them to not be cornering one or another of the guilty parties, but essentially cornering all of them. And people have been killed en masse for taking part in these protests. The price is not symbolic; it is literal. Hundreds have died from the first protests where security services came out and snipers shot people in the head, shot to kill. And the risk has continued to this day because for the ruling elite, there is no prospect of reform. Any reform, however incremental, ends their sort of ruthless patronage-based bargain. If they have to govern even a little bit, the whole formula stops working. So they view any challenge, even as sort of anodyne and generic, as an end to corruption, which, you know, no one's going to overtly come out and say I'm for corruption. But even that is an existential threat to this formula, and the result has been a complete and colossal crackdown from the ruling regime and its allied militias. And nobody who's well-intentioned in the Iraqi power governing structure has the power to resist the constituencies that are in favor of this. And it's not a simple to say that it's an Iranian plot or that it's one or another corrupt militia that supports this. It's almost all of them. And that is a very hard nut to crack because you almost the only imaginable alternative to this is some kind of strong man who would come in and clear things up, which, by the way, and sadly, is something that a lot of fed up citizens will profess to support. The fantasy of an enlightened strongman who can come in and clean up the country. But history suggests that even a populist authoritarian cloaked in a reform program is unlikely to deliver a genuinely renewed concept of citizenship or concept of governance. And so there's simultaneously a fear and disgust with the current ruling structure and a wariness about the alternatives. And more so in Iraq than anywhere else, there's an overt discussion about the risks of a strong state. So the protest movement and the reformists who are criticizing the current arrangement are also not eager to replace it with something that's too centralized or too strong and too easily would lend itself to new kinds of abuses of power. They are quite sanguine about the risks of change because they know that change could be for the worse as well as for the better. Now, what is painfully clear is that people have taken to the streets because the response of the power structure has been uniformly abysmal. So there is zero reason to hope, given by the record of successive governments. In fact, the most recent past prime minister, Adel Abdel Mahdi, was originally touted as a technocrat, a nonpartisan technocrat who would somehow be able to solve some of the persistent problems with electricity and oil field management. He ended up being possibly the worst prime minister that Iraq had. He resigned, I would say in air quotes, at the beginning of the protest, but he then stayed on as caretaker prime minister for nearly a year, until last month when Mustafa Kadhimi was named prime minister. And he too has been touted as a technocrat who will maybe be able to skirt the balance between Iranian pressure and American pressure to address the systemic problems. But he too is a politician without a strong base, without a political party to back him, without any kind of electoral mandate or mandate in the Council of Representatives. So we have, in my view, yet again, a recipe for this kind of paralysis, which is, I would argue, and sadly so, eminently sustainable. Okay, so terrible arrangements that make livelihood and well-being untenable for millions of people can be indefinitely sustainable. I mean, we've seen that in other parts of the region where we look at Israeli occupation as being, unjust, and people have argued that it's unsustainable, and yet it has lasted the better part of half a century. And in Egypt and in other really important Arab countries, terrible governance has been, if enforced with the requisite amount of violence and intolerance, can be long-term sustainable. So that's one of the sort of thought questions that I think is a challenge to those of us who would like to see more accountable, more democratic regimes, better governance, more rights, more meaning reinvested in the idea of citizenship. It's very daunting to look at what turns out to be possible if a regime is adaptable enough or extreme enough in its willingness to use coercion to stay in power. So that leads to the story of Lebanon, which is even more discouraging in many ways, but in some ways also holds some of the promise for what might come to pass in a positive scenario. So in Lebanon, we've had relative domestic peace since the early 1990s. We had a civil war that ended essentially in a ceasefire, with one movement, Hezbollah, allowed to keep its weapons. All the other militias disbanded their armed wings and subsumed them into the Lebanese armed forces. And we had since then ongoing conflict caused by Israel, which repeatedly has invaded or otherwise engaged in conflict with Lebanon, and ultimately we have a sort of, I would argue, a mafia-like arrangement between a group of less than 10 key warlords in Lebanon who divvy up all the power in the country and the patronage that comes with it. Like in Iraq, and I would argue they have served as a sort of template for the evolution of the Iraqi system. They have perfected the practice of governing for self-preservation rather than for governance. And Lebanon is as broken as a country can be, and it would be a joke if it weren't so awful for the people who live in it. It's quite easy to address a lot of these concerns. It's a small country, it's a wealthy country, It's geographically contiguous, has a tiny population compared to most countries, and it has the know-how and level of development and a financial system and technical capacity to build sewers, water treatment, electricity, garbage collection, basic courts, which already are in place, and so on. And yet it has chosen not to do any of these things because the entire system is based on maintaining the absolute power of this group of warlords and mafia-like bosses. So in Lebanon as well, people recognize a very high cost of dissenting against the system. So people mistake the freedom and free speech that exists in Lebanon for a genuine political freedom. The freedom that largely exists there is the freedom to criticize other sectarian leaders if you implicitly endorse the sectarian power structure. So there's no end of people who will publicly come out and criticize Hezbollah or come out and criticize Hezbollah's opponents, and all those people are from members of some other movement that endorses this organizing structure. Now, the people who aren't allowed to publicly dissent are those who criticize the entire sectarian power structure, and those people are ruthlessly suppressed. They have their livelihood stripped away from them. They're quietly taken to prison, sometimes tortured, and then re-released. And we've seen this cycle for 20 years, where the state apparatus and in particular the intelligence services ruthlessly stamps out any even obscure writer who will criticize the system on Facebook, all the way up to any wealthy or connected person who tries to oppose the system. They are crushed, and when protests in the street ever veer away from the sectarian model and begin to, for example, as protests have in the last few years, say all of them are guilty, including the president and the leader of Hezbollah and the leader of the anti-Hezbollah future movement. So any protest or dissident who correctly identifies all the sectarian leaders as sharing in guilt for the ruin of the country, those movements are also treated with violence as an existential threat and stamped out. So today we're in a moment, 10 years since the region rose up in revolt, where the power structure has refused to reform in the slightest. And one can say, why should we expect them to reform themselves out of power as much as we might like them to? And in which the popular protest movements have become, I would say, braver and more persistent as the risks have become more ingrained and higher. And they've become quite sharp at articulating a both ideological and pragmatic critique of the system. Now, proponents of the system often point their fingers at the protest movement and say, what's your solution? Do you have a better idea about governance? And the protest movements, I think, have grappled with this very head on and intelligently, and have found the most compelling answer to this, which is it is not their job to replace the government. These are not opposition movements. These are not political movements that are trying to take over the country. These are citizens movements that are erupting because the countries have passed the point of no return and how broken they are. And these movements are trying to do the one thing they still have the power to do, which is make the country ungovernable, or at least strip the patina of legitimacy away from these dictatorships, in order to force them to change, or to assent to change that would come from a political force. We've seen some cause for optimism from events in Algeria and Sudan, where popular movements have, in the case of Sudan, forced a transitional process into being, where we now have we're in the early stages of a 3-year transition, which may or may not turn out well, but in which a lot of the lessons learned from other Arab revolts have been applied, and the popular movement has been working assiduously to try and force a transition to a democratic system. In Algeria, ongoing popular uprisings and protests, which only abated with the COVID-19 pandemic, forced the end of Bouteflika's 20-year reign, a kind of a deeply flawed presidential election, which is still the result of which are still being protested. But there too, there's cause for optimism. And in Tunisia, we actually have had a successful transition. Now, I would argue that these countries in the Maghreb and on the periphery of the Arab world have less impact on what happens within the Arab core than the core countries themselves do. And the core countries, which go from the Gulf through Iraq to Lebanon and Egypt, have mostly seen successful persistence of authoritarian systems. The two most sort of highest potential places are Lebanon and Iraq, which for all their flaws do have some amount of accountability through their electoral systems and through the fact that they are both governments that are built on power sharing between different groups rather than the domination of a single institutional player, such as the Egyptian army, or a single family, such as the Assad family in Syria. And the demand being made is to redefine citizenship and to redefine stability and security as terms that take into account the well-being of the people who live in these countries. And that is where the West, and particularly the United States, have a role to play. If they were to change their own momentum and become interested in encouraging pluralistic and humane governance, which today I would say is definitely not the case in US foreign policy, and increasingly Europe has been more interested in transactional benefits for European companies than in promoting any kind of better governance or shared sense of rights. But if the United States and Europe become interested once again, or maybe newly interested in improving governance and rights and the lived experience of people in the Middle East region, what they can do is once and for all jettison the use of authoritarian bargains to promote short-term expedient partnerships with strong men and dictators who are on their side in some short-term military dispute like the one with ISIS, and define stability and security as something that are built on a citizenry that is governed with accountability and in a just way that meets the basic needs of those people for livelihood, and that meets the needs of those people for basic dignity under equal treatment under the law. That is, I think, less naive than it may sound, because those are approaches that actually do create more hard security and more political stability in any region in which they're present. But getting there has always been viewed as of a secondary interest and of too much of a risk for outside powers. And of course, for the predatory authoritarians who control the region, there is no interest in seeing that sort of change take place. We're today witnessing, I'd say, an epochal failure and collapse. Iraq's population has doubled since the US invasion in 2003. Climate change is at an apogee in Iraq, which is seeing its water table salinated. It's seeing its deserts grow, its agricultural sector and food security collapse still further. This is a place where upwards of 40 million people live, and where life at times is untenable. Some Iraqis have likened it to me to trying to live on the moon. And in all this, we have a predatory state that is not interested in addressing its citizens' needs. And we have an international sphere which is preoccupied with great power politics or regional, in the case of the United States, obsessed with its maximum pressure policy against Iran, and isn't even looking at the well-being of these millions of people. So I'll close by saying that I expect these revolts to continue as long as these core challenges of governance and citizenship are not addressed. And I expect these regimes to continue adapting as they have, sometimes quite ruthlessly and ingeniously, to perpetuate themselves. And they will not budge or shift unless they are forced to. And for the people who are engaged in these uprisings, and for the outside governments and the domestic constituencies that have any say over this, there's an ever shorter window of opportunity to try and catalyze some kind of positive change in any situation short of catastrophe. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic, which is only now beginning to peak in Iraq and recently in Yemen and Egypt, and sadly will in the rest of the Middle Eastern countries that haven't been hit hard yet, is another one of these tests. I think the regimes can survive it, without taking care of the health needs of their people, but the costs are huge and disproportionately borne by the most vulnerable, and ultimately are tallied in avoidable deaths and avoidable misery. And eventually at some point we'll come to a point where either those systems will have to change, or they will be clearly, they'll go to the extreme of where they are now, where I think Lebanon has already arrived, where the regimes will no longer even pretend to be about governance or rights, and will simply be about self-perpetuation. With that, I will turn it over to you for any questions you have or things you want to discuss, and thank you all for staying on the line. I see we've had a consistent number of participants there, which is great. I was expecting to see the number drop as I talked, so thanks for at least staying connected, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Thanassis. Those were great, incredible remarks, and enlightening as well. So I guess we can just jump right in to the Q&A. And so I see the Q&A box has been lighting up throughout your remarks. So the first one I'm going to go to is Caitlin Marie Gardiner. She asks, I believe, how do media deserts impact the effectiveness of these protests and correcting systemic shortcomings?
I take it by media deserts, do you mean the places where there isn't a free press? Can we let Caitlin speak so she can clarify?
Yeah, Caitlin, if you want, I can make you answer live. I don't want to put you on the spot, but or you can type in the chat box to clarify.
Well, while I'm waiting for her clarification, I'll say that in general, there has been a sort of blossoming of space for critical discourse throughout the region. So despite like unprecedented repression in places like Egypt and even recently in Iraq, there is also a great deal of more of a public square than there was pre-internet. So there are places, and I'm not just talking about Twitter and Facebook, there are ways in which people can communicate with each other about political dissent that they couldn't before. And there are places where people can sharpen their ideas about dissent. But Unfortunately, the reach and the impact of those kinds of spaces is quite limited. Ultimately, the dominant media in every single one of these countries is either directly state controlled or it's private television that is controlled by people who support the government. So, and you know, for every like Madame Masr that has 20 or 30,000 readers, there is a satellite television station with 30 million or 40 million viewers that can shape the government, the narrative in the government's to the government's advantage, and that I think has been decisive. I don't think civil society in general and media work is capable of overthrowing state domination. So this has been one of the interesting evolving understandings among activists and Western governments, which is that, you know, civil society work is great, it's meaningful, it's important. Elite opinion formation is significant, it matters. If you have dissidents and activists able to speak to each other and learn from their experience and share their views and sharpen them, that is significant. It is not, however, sufficient for overthrowing a dictatorship that has the resources of the state at its disposal. And so there's often a sort of unrealistic expectations freighted on these sorts of spaces. And there's also, especially in the West, a lot of misreading of these spaces where, you know, I've sort of heard no end of glib dismissal where, you know, Western analysts will say, oh, there's no, you know, nobody's articulating a coherent critique of the system. And you know, in fact, lots of people are. There are lots of smart, well-developed alternatives being written about and being espoused. However, they're not reaching a huge audience because of the enormous amount of censorship at work in places like Egypt and Syria. And in a place like Iraq, there's a huge danger to anyone who criticizes the system. There's been a spate of assassinations of women who were social media influencers who had won large followings and were not even really making political arguments in public, but were defying the retrograde control of certain clerics over social norms. And many of them have been very publicly assassinated as a signal, I think, to people in the public sphere who are going to depart from norms. And that's not even overt political dissidents. So I do think that these authoritarian systems are very brittle, and the lesson that they have taken from Syria and from Egypt is to go extreme, go violent, and do it often and early. And I'm afraid. I mean, that's been in the short term a successful strategy for them, and it really creates a tough challenge for reformers and critics.
Thank you. So I guess from your remarks, so it appears like ecology and demographics will be the variables that will mostly contribute to political outcomes in the region. Maybe not towards democracy, but rather further towards chaos. Will you expand on that?
Ecological crises, you mean like climate change? And
right.
So I'm not really decided on what result those types of crises have on poor governance. So it's absolutely clear to me that the MENA region is at the cutting edge of the climate crisis and of environmental degradation. So from the Nile water problems in Egypt to the problems I mentioned in Iraq relating to climate change and potable water and pollution from the oil industry. In Lebanon, the breaking points that have been reached recently have been around garbage collection. So in all of these cases, we're talking about, straightforward environmental challenges. What to do about pollution, what to do about waste, what to do about climate control in our homes, what to do about food security, drinking water, sewage, and I'm afraid that the short-term lesson has been that it turns out complete abdication on these fronts isn't enough to make a government collapse. That's been Lebanon's experience, right? So Lebanon sort of peaked in the year of 2000, quality of life, post-Civil War quality of life in Lebanon peaked. So in terms of hours of electricity per day, in terms of garbage pickup working, in terms of all the health system, everything was working. It turns out the best that it's worked since. Every year since 2000, so for 20 years now, we've had a marked decline. And this is a country of rich, educated people who live in a toxic, poisoned environment that is, optionally so, right? It doesn't have to be this way, but the powers that control the country have chosen to make it this way. It's a place where, I lived there for 6 years with my children. I just moved back to New York 2 years ago. People get sick all the time because of the toxic environment, and people live under this kind of horror, and they don't like it, and they complain to their political leaders and their bosses about it, and the response is that things get worse every year. And all of these problems, or most of these problems, have clear solutions. In some cases, there is a new water and sewage system that was built with European funding and that hasn't been put online because of corruption. The same goes for electricity and fiber optic cables that have been built and not turned on or connected because of the corrupt leaders' inability to come up with a formula for how to share the proceeds of the corruption that would come from improved systems. If you really dive into the details and then you pull back, it seems like if you're willing as a state to kill people who dissent, you can abuse them as much as you want, fail to address these environmental crises, and stay in power. And I think the experiment underway in the region by these despots is to see how far they can go with that. Can vast areas of Iraq become literally uninhabitable, and people have to flee as climate refugees from one part of the country to the other, and the same corrupt people will still be able to stay in power? They think they can, and maybe they'll be able to.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to Peter, who has a question. Do you think the U.S. policy benefits from state weakness and authoritarian regimes in the region, in that an authoritarian is easier to control or influence as opposed to a democratic system?
I absolutely think that U.S. policy perceives that to be the case. So I think that, in fact, no, it doesn't. Right? This is why I describe these things as short-term expedient authoritarian bargains that enable the U.S. to find a partner, let's say, in the war on terror. But I think the war on terror is bad policy also. So as I define American interests, no, none of this suits American interests either. But for sure, in general, Western governments have preferred to have predictable partners rather than accountable partners, because a predictable partner can be relied on for hard security transactions or for other even more diplomatic assistance, because you're not dealing with a democratic political process. You're dealing with with a one-person rule. So if you get agreement from the leader, you know what you're going to get. So that has been That has been the guiding principle of foreign relations, not just by the United States, but especially by the United States in the region. I would argue that everybody wins if that is to change. Okay, so like, I mean, this is a kind of bad example, but I think it's interesting to bring up. When the U.S. wanted to send part of its invading forces into Iraq through Turkey, Turkey said no because the parliament opposed it. Now, this was also before Erdogan had become the authoritarian that he is today. I wouldn't argue that Turkey was a full-blown democracy in 2003 either, but there was a fair, I mean, there was democratic input into Turkey's policy process, and as a result of that, Turkey said no to America, and that was a good choice by Turkey. And had America been more responsive and democratically accountable at that point, such a pushback might have made America reconsider its misbegotten war on Iraq. Now, it didn't. They just sent more troops in from the South. But more democratic accountability is good for everybody because it forces more policies to be designed with the well-being of more constituencies in mind. It's harder to get things done with more stakeholders having a voice, but the things you get done, I think, are better. Now, that is not an assumption that's shared by everyone. Certainly, it's not the guiding principle of American foreign policy today. And I think that one of the reimaginings that we have to have is we have to start defining security and stability as being a world in which a greater number of people experience more well-being and have a greater say in how they're governed. That, in my view, by the way, is the fundamental driving principle of democracy. And no one says it's easier. We just, those of us who like the idea of democracy over authoritarianism, think that the ultimate outcomes are better for people. And that is would require a real shakeup in the way interests are defined. Also, on the notes you raised in your question, the United States, in order to be a force for good in the Middle East, would have to stop thinking of itself as a leader or as the primary mover in the region, and that is also something that under Trump is not really yet in the cards. But we are at a historical shifting point where both major parties in the United States have decided that they are less interested than they were in the past in being involved in foreign entanglements and some foreign wars. Now, this can lead to a reality like today, where it's the worst of all worlds, where the U.S. pulls out of some conflicts while starting others and is erratic and equally prone to contribute to violence, be it in Yemen or with Iran, rather than in old theaters. So we get pullback without a reconception of how to promote common values and governance. But there is a possible good direction that this leads to, where the U.S. stops trying to dictate and starts acting more like one of many countries in a multipolar world, and seeks places where it has shared values and interests, like, by the way, it does in Iraq, and where it could pursue those things as a collaborative diplomatic project rather than as one that is dictated by fiat, or where U.S. interests are the only ones that are factored in. I don't think that's likely to happen soon, but I would guess in a few more electoral cycles, let's say a decade from now, when the diminishment of American power has fully set in, and the U.S. Across the board begins to come to terms with the fact that it won't ever be the unipolar sole superpower again, and where more countries around the world realize that, say, Chinese dominance or Russian resurgence isn't that appealing either, we might be able to see a rebalancing where shared interests and values begin to shape interactions between weaker states in the MENA region and stronger states outside of it.
Peter, I hope that answered your question. In your remarks, you talked, in the context of Iraq, which was exceptionally interesting to me. And I know in some of your publications, you've spoken about what's happening in the Samarra region with Sadr as well. And I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit on that, the significance there for Iraq within the Samarra region, but it also couples with Caitlin's question where she asks, can Iraq become a viable state and how?
So the piece you're referring to, I wrote, I guess about a year ago, and I've done a lot of research over the years into the Sadrist current, there was so first of all, Muqtada Sadr is one of the most significant opposition leaders in Iraq, and he has a millions strong following that is sort of blindly loyal to him, and which he's been able to deploy in street protests against the American occupation, against various manifestations of the Iraqi government over the years. But he must be properly understood as a sort of system player, not like he's an antagonistic stakeholder of the system. He's not an opponent of the system. So the Sadrists have been blamed at some points for toppling Iraqi governments. They did win the greatest number of votes in the last elections, although they were unable to form a government of their own. And ultimately, they've been part and parcel of the system throughout. So the Sadrists control the health ministry and have since 2005. So if you want to look at technocracy or competence in the failure to deal with the COVID pandemic, that's a Sadrist failure. What's been interesting about Muqtada and his rhetoric and that of his following is that he has been, at least rhetorically, non-sectarian and sometimes overtly anti-sectarian. So he has tried to position himself as an Iraqi nationalist, as someone whose authority, yes, comes from being the scion of a clerical dynasty and from a sort of clearly Shia following, but since 2003, he's always been quick to try and build bridges with other nationalists and other groups that view themselves as Iraqi rather than as sectarian, and that at the current moment, and really ever since the rise of ISIS, there's been a renewed urgency to rebuilding an Iraqi identity that can feed a political structure that is not sectarian and not identity-based. In an identity-driven, fractured, and sectarian polity, groups like ISIS will always have an opening, and governance is always going to be hostage to sectarian patronage. So any kind of building of a better Iraqi system is going to require there being political identities that aren't sectarian or identity based. And Sadr has been the most powerful figure who has flirted with that kind of rhetoric and identity building. He partnered with the Iraqi Communist Party. He has moved away from various intolerant or sectarian positions. Now, it's important to note he is he's an unscrupulous, corrupt power player himself. There's no reason to believe that he is deeply committed to an anti-sectarian and not identity-based worldview. Just that he has, at least for a short period of time, viewed this as useful. So we don't want to read too much into the position he's taken. But he's not alone in the Iraqi space in doing this. The one previous prime minister who led the war against ISIS in its latter stages, Haider Abadi, also successfully represented a nationalist identity. The current prime minister, Mustafa Kadhimi, who is not that powerful, remember, and doesn't have a political party behind him, also subscribes to this kind of nationalist approach. And there is a, there is a sort of large, perhaps, I don't know if it's a silent majority, but there's a sizable constituency of Iraqis who do not define themselves in sectarian terms. And there's also another large body of Iraqis who came from a sectarian context, and since the end of the ISIS war have realized that sectarian politics has failed them. So a great deal of Sunni Iraqis who were excluded from the system and then who were not supporters of ISIS saw their society destroyed and are now living in the ruins of their Sunni areas, find themselves sharing a common sense of purpose with poor Shia from the south of Iraq who came and liberated those areas from ISIS, who also experienced a great deal of loss, many, many deaths, and have come home to their areas and find themselves also living in rack and ruin with poisoned drinking water and no resources and no money and no jobs. And they realize that that it's not a sectarian deal. It's everyone is getting screwed by the state, and that they are connected in their disenfranchisement, and they're being pillaged essentially as Iraqis by a rapacious ruling class. So there is a growing group of or set of groups that see things this way. They include a lot of the protest movement, and it's not clear to me when that gathers or how that gathers enough momentum to force the state to change. And it's also unclear to me what are the positive ways in which the Iraqi state can constitute itself as a viable and useful entity. There is a question in the chat, can Iraq become a viable state? And I think the answer is it can, but it can also continue as is. It can continue on indefinitely as a failing or failed state, as it is today. And it's very possible that today's equilibrium, which is awful as a lived experience for Iraqis, could be sustainable for decades and decades to come.
So Lewis Rolls, he asked the question of, can the diaspora of either country be able to influence reform movements or influence other governments to address the uprisings? And I believe he's speaking to Lebanon and Iraq.
So the diaspora can vote with its money, and to the extent that there are powerful people in the diaspora who want to use their power to try and influence the system, they can do so. Now, the two cases are different. In Lebanon, the economy depends entirely on remittances. So without remittances, Lebanon is not a going concern, and it's possible that the economic collapse that's underway now is actually going to completely topple the order of things. But if it doesn't, diaspora money is what's going to keep it afloat. Now, there's no single group or set of individuals that can steer that money in a way that would force a different political outcome. So we have a sort of collective action problem. Now, what people, regular individuals in the diaspora, I don't think have that much to do. People who go back to Lebanon and agitate and try and work in either within the system or without could have some effect, but I'd say not that much. what we've seen in the last year is, I'd say, an exemplary popular movement, which has so far not been sufficient to change any outcome. Now, Iraq is a different case. Iraq's diaspora is powerful and really shameful. The governing class, I mean, the amount of people in parliament and in the government who don't actually live in Iraq or have their families there is stunning. I've never seen like a systematic breakdown, but most of the people I meet who are in senior positions have their spouses and children living in a different country. They won't actually have their families live in Iraq with them. And they themselves often have primary residences in the West. So you have a ruling class that is presiding over the decimation of their country, and their kids and their families are living in France and England and the suburbs of Washington D.C. Or at best in Beirut, and it's part of why the country's in such awful shape, because the rulers don't have to live with the consequences of it. They don't, the government, people in the government don't get medical treatment in Iraq. They get their medical treatment abroad. They do their shopping abroad. They get their clothes abroad. And so there is no incentive to fix things, even for the elite within Iraq. What can the diaspora do about that? They can go home, and I guess others can try to name and shame members of the elite who won't live in the country that they govern. But I think these are meaningful but small symbolic gestures, because the ruination is so total and really at a core level that doing something about it requires changing the power structure from the top.
Thank you. And so I think we have time for one more question. And I will go to Caitlin. She asked, do you think that the fact that the West refused to sustain dialogue with the Syrian regime before the outbreak of the civil war was a mistake? Could Europe or the US have prevented the humanitarian disaster in Syria?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that question means. I mean, the frame of the question just seems off to me. It doesn't describe the facts as I understand them. The Syrian civil war occurred because one of the worst regimes in the world chose to respond to a peaceful protest movement that made reasonable incremental requests with an inhuman amount of mass violence. And it killed and imprisoned and tortured huge numbers of people until it eventually created an armed uprising. So that's how the Civil War started. It had nothing to do with a Western dialogue with the regime. The West didn't start that war. The West made lots of mistakes in its handling of the uprising, including making a false sort of promise that it would really back an uprising against Assad full-throatedly, which it wasn't willing to do. But the West didn't start that uprising, and to the extent that it became violent in the Civil War, that was entirely in the hands of the state. So, what the West, and also, by the way, so the West contributed marginally to the continuation of the armed uprising once it became an armed uprising, and also the West has spent billions of dollars on humanitarian aid, the most generous donor of which has been the United States. And a lot of that money has gone through corrupt regime channels, which have actually enriched this disgusting regime that's been responsible for all the suffering in the first place. So, the real question there for me is, should the West, and particularly the United States, continue to spend money on any kind of aid, since that aid is enriching the regime that's been responsible for all the suffering. And that's a really tough question. I find it easier to answer the question on sanctions. I don't think we should support sanctions because I think sanctions won't change regime behavior and they will make people suffer. But with aid, it's tough because some of that aid trickles down to people who need it, and a lot of it goes to prop up really awful practices, and it makes donor governments complicit with authoritarianism. And on the other hand, this noxious regime seems to have survived and won the war. So what's the point of punishing the people who live under it for the outcome of the war? I think that's a situation in which there's really no good answer, and any policy course is going to be unsatisfactory.
Thank you. So I think those are all the questions that came into the Q&A. If anybody has any more, feel free to submit them. We have a couple more minutes. But I guess, on a question I had too, and understanding and looking at social movements, and I know Dr. Van Vakis, he teaches a course on street democracy. And Charles Tilley, he brings up these 4 points, right, in social movements, which is worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. And I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on that, and speak to those, I guess, that acronym within the protests that are happening, in the revolts and across we were speaking about in Lebanon and Iraq. Would you have anything to add to them, or do you think they have fulfilled some of those areas?
Can you clarify again what areas you're asking about, so I can make sure I'm answering what you
right.
are asking?
So Charles Tilley speaks on worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and what's happening in the respective states.
So I guess the question is, like, how effective are these social movements on Tilley's criteria?
Exactly. And if there's anything you would add as well.
Well, so in general terms, I think these social movements and these uprisings have been very they've been very brave and adaptive, and they have very self-consciously tried to learn from from the literature, the social science literature on social movements. I know all these activists in Lebanon who are reading Tilley and all kinds of other SMT texts. So there's and they are studying in great detail what's happening in other countries in their region and in other regions. Okay, so they're not perceiving their struggle in a vacuum. They're very overtly looking at other social movements and trying to learn from them. And I think it's a little bit misguided to try and score. So there's a lot of analysis that tries to score how good are these movements doing, or criticizes them for not being political enough in their critique, or for not trying to seize power directly. My take is that that they've all, certainly in Lebanon and Iraq, but I'd say almost across the board, they've performed excellently and better than could be expected from the context, and certainly they've displayed a great deal of quick adaptive learning from their own context and from outside their context, and that's good as far as it goes. It's just not enough, right? I mean, it's not that's not how you overthrow or force change in a system like the one in Lebanon or Iraq, where the ruling power has state intelligence apparatus, state military, state industry, and all the patronage and jobs and tools of control that affords. Para militias that can intimidate, control, and kill and dominate spaces in ways that the official security apparatus can't do. So it has all these things on its side. So it doesn't matter how well, it does matter how well these movements do in terms of building constituency, following, ideological critique, coherence, staying power, and so on. Those are incredibly important metrics. It turns out they're just not sufficient to challenge the state at this point. And what, as a policy question, what should they do differently? I'm not sure there's something they should be doing differently. I mean, should they be trying to take over the military and then stage a coup? That doesn't seem like a great, one, that doesn't seem like it would work, and two, that doesn't seem like a great idea. The alternatives that are theoretically at their disposal, if they want to be more successful at challenging the power, are not appealing. So I think they're really trying to maximize their long-term influence through democratic means, non-violent democratic means, which disadvantage them inherently against a violent state. I'm not sure what the answer is. Like, if you, in an ideal scenario, you would have these citizen movements that are, going on in their 10th year, pushing from below, and then you would have an international sphere that would push from above or from the side to actually encourage better governance instead of authoritarian bargains. And then you might get elite defections at that point, where you might then have some parties or players within the political system, some industrialists, some members of the leadership of the security services that would be willing to defect from the existing bargain and move towards a more democratic approach. But we've never gotten there yet. We've never even had those first two conditions in place to see who might defect. Like in Lebanon's case, it's hard to imagine because they're all so rotten. In Iraq's case, it's entirely possible that key militia leaders and key politicians and key rich people would be willing to jump ship from the current elite bargain if wealthy and powerful outside nations were supporting it and there was a sustained citizens movement in its favor. I hope we find out.
Thank you. I definitely agree. And I guess, we're just coming at the end of this lecture. So I just wanted to thank you again for your time and for being here this afternoon or evening for folks that are elsewhere around the world. I think we definitely hope that we can have you at the Institute or in Crete once this is all over.
Yeah, I'd much prefer to have a follow-on dialogue to this in Crete than from my bedroom in Brooklyn. But thank you very much for having me, and thank you everybody who attended and participated in the conversation. And thanks for listening.
Thank you. And while I have everybody here, just wanted to give an update about tomorrow. We have two other lectures: the Eastern Mediterranean to the Black Sea and the Eurasian Stability, with Dr. Antonio Calibanasu at 10 a.m. EDT, 1700 EEST. That will be followed by Greek-Turkish Relations Transformed with Dr. Dimitris Toussaharas at 1400 EDT, 2100 EEST. And I thank you again, Mr. Cambanis, for your time, for your remarks. I know the rest of the lecturers are going to have some big shoes to fill between you and Mr. Naftu this morning. So thank you. Thank you for all who attended, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and evening.
Thank you.